Come on, just one more drink. You know I'm good for it. The bartender looked at me evenly. His dark eyes slitted as he tried to hide his frustration. I know no such thing. You still got money on your books from last week, and you dare to come in here flaunting your wealth? I was a fool to let you drink before you'd settled your tab. Now get out. The other drunks at the bar laughed, egging the bartender on as he crossed his arms. I wanted to argue, but the man was quite a bit larger than me, and I realized the futility of continuing. He would win, just as everyone did when they went up against me, so I hung my head and mumbled something about leaving. As I stepped into the cold winter air, I felt some of my buzz deteriorate, the derision of my drinking companions following me out into the chill weather. I was too drunk to be walking home, but it was my only means of conveyance. I live in Osaka, at least I did at the time, back in the early 2000s. I was not what you would call a solid citizen. I believe the word most of my culture uses for people like me is a NEET. It basically means I wasn't enrolled in school, wasn't working on a family, and I wasn't working in a job. I'd never been very diligent a worker or a very good student. The jobs I'd had were, well, menial, and often didn't last longer than a month or two. My grades had been good enough to get me into several very expensive cram schools, but not into college. With no real prospects, I'd settled into my life as a nobody. My parents paid for a cheap one-bedroom apartment in a part of town where you had to step over the winos as they stumbled home, and they sent me money to avoid having me come to the house and bring shame on them. I didn't care. All my money went to booze or even less lofty pursuits, and I was essentially circling the drain. I suppose fate had another plan, though, because that was when I met a very special woman on my way home. I had been celebrating a small victory that night, but it seems that my luck had run out. I had a little extra money after my raffle ticket had brought a small windfall, and I'd been buying drinks for a few of the barflies in an effort to get some female companionship that evening. They had taken my drinks and laughed at my jokes, but when the money was gone, so were they. I'd drunk up all my extra money, and after having no luck mooching drinks from the usual bar patrons, I was forced to head home. It was early December, and the snow on the ground was only an inch or two. The black ice glistened treacherously from the damp pavement, and I was trying my best not to weave too much as the bracing air took some of my buzz with it. The streets were mostly deserted, a few late-night pedestrians here and there, and the lights were far from seasonal. We don't really celebrate Christmas in Japan, not like the Americans do, and the lights here were usually from billboards or the advertisements that lit the night as well as the street lamps. I'd turned a corner, heading from the trendy part of town I'd been drinking in into the less savory areas where I lived, when I first saw her. I stopped for a moment, not quite believing what I was seeing. It was a youngish woman, her black hair blowing in the wind, and her bare feet walking delicately atop the snow. She was dressed in some kind of robe, a wrapper too light for the weather, and I followed behind her as I tried to find the courage to speak to her. If she was out here and so little on a night like this, then she had to be as drunk as I was. Either that or on some kind of drug, but neither of that mattered much to me. There was heat in my apartment and a little beer in the fridge. We could get warm together, maybe have a little drink and watch the sun come up over the edge of my balcony. In her current state, I had little doubt that she'd be glad for a warm place to stay, and as I quickened my pace to come even with her, I tried to find my best opening gambit. "Good evening, beautiful. What's a flower like you doing out in the snow?" Now that we were even with each other, I could see her better. Her skin was as perfect as a china doll, her complexion smooth as porcelain, and her color as pale as milk. Her eyes were small and dark, focused ahead as she made her way towards wherever she was going, and it almost seemed like she was ignoring me. That was nothing new. Women often pretended they couldn't see me, but it was the little glances that kept me invested. She kept glancing at me with this coquettish look, favoring me with these intriguing lifts of her lips, and they kept me interested. "Aren't you cold? I know somewhere you can come to warm up. Your feet must be freezing." We were about 5 or 6 blocks away from my apartment, and she seemed to be heading in that direction anyway. I thought my luck might be turning around. The two of us kept walking, me chatting away as she glided across the icy sidewalk. She seemed immune to the black ice that sometimes tripped me up, and I began to notice how smoothly she moved. I know that sounds a little strange, but she moved as if her feet never touched the ground. It was like watching someone operate an extremely lifelike puppet, but it only seemed odd through the lens of memories. At the time, I was just a drunk and slightly amorous male who was hoping to trick this clearly intoxicated woman back to his apartment. I'm not the hero of this story. That should be pretty obvious. "What's your name?" I asked, realizing I didn't even know what her name was, but all I got in return was the same sly side-eye. Her face was utterly emotionless until she glanced at me and smirked. She seemed to know how to keep me interested, and I had become less flustered by the wind the longer we walked. I felt myself slowing to match her pace, my wet socks and cold feet no longer bothering me, and as we turned onto a familiar street, I realized we were about 2 blocks from my apartment. I could even see my window from here, the buttery yellow light spilling out onto the street through the dirty windows of the sliding door, and I smiled as I thought about how the sun would look as it came up through that pallid portal. When she turned suddenly, I almost missed it. We were nearly there, the front gate to my apartment complex, less than 20 steps up the road, and she had suddenly glided into the space between 2 buildings. The alley was a known haunt for winos and bums, and I found myself standing at the entrance as I watched her stroll into the semi-darkness. She'd captured me effortlessly, and when she spun preternaturally in the low light and crooked a finger at me, I was taking that first step before I could stop myself. Luckily for me, the black ice got me before she did. I slipped, falling on my butt, and as the cold rushed over me, I sobered a little. That was how I noticed that, despite the snow in the alley being deep enough to cover the first 3 inches of the garbage can or the dumpster that was there, she hadn't left a single footprint in the snow. I looked back and saw that the only footprints back the way we had come were mine, and that was when something hung in my booze-soaked brain. "Beware the Yuki-onna, my son," my mother had told me when I was very young. "Be careful that she doesn't get you while you're out in the snow." I had stopped on my way out the door, my sled under my arm and my boots unmarked by moisture as of yet, and asked her what that was. "Yuki-onna sometimes hunt handsome men and try to take their life force. It stalks them through the snow, luring them away so it can get them alone, and freezes them in place as it draws out their precious life energy. So if a beautiful woman tries to take you away, come home quick and tell me so I can scare her off." She had said it jokingly, but as I sat in the snow, I realized I was about to do exactly what she had warned me against. The porcelain woman, the woman I now noticed left no trace behind, crooked a finger at me again, but I was up and running before it could waggle more than once. Fortune was with me, and I didn't find another puddle of ice until I reached the stoop of my apartment. I could hear her behind me, her scream the roar of a winter wind, and as I rounded the gate, I came into the courtyard and expected to be pounced on at any minute. It would serve me right, I realized, as I came shakily up the steps of the front porch. I had thought I was the hunter, seeking my prey to lure it home, but I'd been tricked and ran afoul of a much larger beast. I stumbled on the ice near the door, fumbling my key from my pocket, and as I looked up, I saw her reflected in the glass. Her hair was no longer straight, writhing behind her as it rose like a nest of vipers. The wrapper now looked more like a funeral shroud, the edges tattered and dark with grave soil. Her dark eyes were now large and round, their centers full of terrible knowledge, and her jaw was opened much too wide as I slammed the key into the lock and rushed inside. I shoved the door closed behind me, expecting a loud bang as she barreled through it, but when I turned to look from the stairs, the courtyard was empty, save for the snowdrifts. I drank the beer in my fridge alone that night, realizing how close I had come to death, and deciding that it was time to make a change. I called my mother the next day and told her I needed help. That was 20 years ago, and my nights of midnight carousing are behind me. I went to cram school, got my test scores up, and started college. I now work as an engineer. My wife and I met in college, and we got married after she finished her doctorate. We have an apartment in a much better part of town, a son getting ready for high school, and my current life is as far from that apartment where I saw the snow woman as night is from day. I no longer depend on my parents, and I've left the rut that I wallowed in for far too long behind me. I still go out drinking with my coworkers sometimes, but now I'm careful how much I have before making my way home. On the night I barely escaped death, 2 homeless men were found frozen to death in that very alley. The news believed that they had succumbed to the elements, but I think the Yuki Onna was simply looking for a third course in its long meal. Some nights, when the snow falls and the leaves drift on the sidewalk, I sit in my apartment and just wonder if it's still out there, hunting the streets of Osaka for its next meal. Then I remember how lucky I am to have escaped the cold embrace of the Yuki Onna. You're still here. Thanks so much for joining us for tonight's spooky tale. If you'd like a little bit more spooky in your life, why not click on one of the videos that appears at the end of our story, or maybe head on over to one of our playlists where you can get your fill of spooky content. If you like your spooky a little more tactile, I've got a new book that's come out. If you'd like your own copy, there's a link below in the description where you can get your own copy of my spooky book. If you like what you see here on the channel and think you might like to support in a more monetized way, then why not come over to Patreon or become a member on YouTube? Speaking of, let's go ahead and thank our members now. Thanks to Civ Garstad and Unicorn Hollow for being our spooky ghost contributors. Thanks to Saikat, Lee Kendall, Janet, and Chris Kinsella for being our spooky skeleton tier contributors. And, of course, thanks to Xaronan, Winter, Tyler Parker, Stephanie Carrington, Sarah ASMR, Hi Stacy, Emily Coltsfoot, and Cinnamon Fox, and Bella Lee for being our ghostly reader tier contributors. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. As I said, if you'd like to have your name read out at the end of every episode that I make, and maybe get a little more, come on down to Patreon and sign up, or become a member on YouTube. Ghostly Reader tier contributors get a book anytime I write one, which is usually about twice a year. So, what are you waiting for? Come on down and give it a look. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.